thereafter, in July of 2011, the Suffolk County Crime Lab linked the two sets of remains via DNA analysis. And by that, I mean the legs that were found in the vicinity of Davis Park were compared with the remains found at Tobay Beach, and it was determined that it was the same person. Since 2011, that victim was known by various names, including Fire Island Jane Doe. Today, we are here to announce that as part of the GILGO Task Force re-examination of all the evidence in the case, we were able to identify Fire Island Jane Doe as Karen Vergata, who was 34 years old at the time of her disappearance. And I believe we have a picture of Miss Vergata. And I think it's important that we remember and honor not only Miss Vergata, but all the victims on GILGO Beach. Ms. Vergata went missing at approximately February 14th, 1996. At the time, she lived on West 45th Street in Manhattan and was believed to be working as an escort at the time of her disappearance.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In 2011, the remains of Karen Vergata were found near the remains of 10 other people. It's taken 12 years to figure out Vergata's DNA puzzle, but the news headlines following yesterday's press conference said it all. GILGO Beach murders, police identified Jane Doe 7, but won't say if the victim has a link to Rex Heuermann. On the one hand, it seems obvious that the victim fits the profile of 3 or 4 of the other victims. On the other hand, due to the length of time we're talking about, 26 years, there is clearly a possibility that this victim isn't related to the Long Island serial killer case. What do I think? I think it might be challenging in a legal setting to prove a connection without any evidence, and I think the passage of time has made it even more difficult. I think the fact that the cops didn't say there was a connection was because they couldn't prove one at this time. What made Fire Island Jane Doe Karen Vergata's disappearance so difficult to investigate was that no one reported her missing when she disappeared, and that was on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1996. The fact that it's taken 27 years just to identify her also illustrates just how much the DA has its work cut out for him. In this analysis, I want to talk about the legal arguments that might be relied on as they relate to Karen Vergata. Again, can Suffolk County prove a connection to Rex Heuermann? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So in terms of victimology, I must say I hate that word, but there it is. When we compare Vergata to the 4 other victims that have been associated with the suspect, with Rex Heuermann, Karen Vergata is around 10 years older, and her murder appears to predate the others by at least a decade. The third aspect that's different, that sticks out with Vergata, is that her remains were dismembered and apparently scattered. All 3 differences, her age, the point on the timeline when this happened, as well as the way her remains were disposed of, are important to bear in mind. Now let's look at the similarities. As far as I'm concerned, the similarities outweigh the differences. The similarities are Karen Vergata was an escort. Her body was found more or less on the same stretch of beach as GILGO Beach. Her body was found on the same side of the beach, the bay side, as the other victims. And then by far the biggest red flag of all, she was based in Manhattan, West 45th Street, which is just a few blocks away from Heuermann's consultancy on 5th Avenue, which is sort of in line with West 36th. If you ask me what connects him to her, my answer is location, location, location. it seems oddly coincidental that she lives in Manhattan, Midtown, and ends up on the shore of GILGO Beach. Needless to say, the suspect in this case operates between precisely these two areas. Also, if we're concerned about time, well, the most recent victims have only been associated with the suspect after a more than 10-year hiatus. And that then brings us to legal intertextuality. The legal challenge in this case may not be as difficult as it seems. The priority doesn't need to be proving a case or any direct link between the Long Island serial killer and Vergata, but with one or more of the other victims and then adding Vergata as a victim as well. Let me explain what I mean. A huge weakness in the Laurie Vallow case was proving what had happened in the murders of 3 individuals. Like, how was Laurie directly or indirectly involved in the deaths of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy Daybell? And this was a huge weakness in the prosecution's case because there's a scenario of the case going cold and clues lost. And interestingly, the prosecutors then used a 4th victim, Charles, who was actually killed in a different state, and they explained all the connections there, all the clues, all the evidence related to that case, and then identified similar patterns with the other 3 victims. So you can prove your case by, in a way, proving a different case or having another case show the patterns that are reinforced in your case. So in a real sense, Karen Vergata in the Laurie Vallow case was Laurie Vallow's daughter, right, in a symbolic sense, whose remains were almost completely destroyed. It was a similar situation. So not only was there virtually no evidence in that instance, but cause of death was impossible to ascertain as well. But what made Laurie's daughter's death easier to investigate was the fact that her brother's body was buried just a few yards away on the same property, and his remains weren't destroyed. Laurie's hair was also found on the duct tape on that child's body, and then also that a similar set of circumstances that preceded the death of the one child also preceded the other child's death. And this was borne out in statements, in text messages, GPS movements recorded on the perpetrator's phone. All the cops needed to show was the fabric surrounding the murder of one child, how that was duplicated at the time of the murder of the other. So being buried on the same property was one aspect, tying the crimes to the same perpetrator. But the fact that they were siblings and they were buried on the property of a man their mother was having an affair with, that made things a lot more simple and straightforward. An analogy for this case is that all the victims in the GILGO Beach killings are in a kind of sisterhood. They're related through, I don't know if this sounds strange, but let's call it the sisterhood of sexual services. Sounds a bit strange, but basically because they're all escorts. And at least those Heuermann has been charged with killing. Now, they're all escorts, they all come from somewhere else, and they end up on GILGO Beach. And somehow I don't think the date Vergata went missing is incidental. Someone knew they were going to be alone on Valentine's Day in 1996. That was an unpleasant prospect for them, and he didn't want to be. Interestingly, Heuermann and Asa Ellerup married just 2 months later, in April 1996. In other words, about 2 months after the murder of Jane Doe number 7, Karen Vergata, Heuermann married his wife, who's now just divorced him. That then brings up another question. Why use a picture of this victim in her pigtails and as a teenager? Clearly, the cops didn't show pictures at their press conference of a 34-year-old Karen Vergata, right? Why did they use a picture of her as a teenager? It's possible they couldn't find a recent picture of her, but which would correspond to, her perhaps being neglected and forgotten about. But another possibility is that the target audience isn't us. It's her mother, or either of her children, or their father, the father of her children, or some other family member. Her own father said that he last heard from her when she called him from jail on his birthday, That was February 1996. This is according to court papers filed in 2015 seeking to have her declared dead. The idea of the press conference is to, I believe, indirectly solicit help, possibly from other escorts, or from family or friends or both. What law enforcement need, I think, is likely Birgaita's cell phone number. Other escorts might have had it at the time. The vehicle that she was using, a sense of her habits and movements, and what they want to do is then try and match her fabric, potentially with Rex Heuermann's. For example, had he solicited her before? There's more to say in terms of this latest victim that is potentially another of the Long Island serial killer's victims, but I'll leave that for the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.